Prime Minister Stephen Harper made a small shuffle to his cabinet Friday, following last week's surprise resignation by the former Aboriginal Affairs Minister John Duncan. Bernard Valcourt has assumed responsibility for the Aboriginal Affairs file, while BC MP Carrie Lynn Findlay moves into Valcourt's previous post as Associate Minister of National Defence. In addition to serving as Minister of National Revenue, Gail Shea will now run the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and Veteran Affairs Minister Stephen Blaney will take over La Francophonie. The ceremonial ribbon has been cut on the Tories' newest initiative, the creation of the Office of Promotion of Religious Freedom. The new office, housed within the Department of Foreign Affairs, will cost taxpayers $5 million per year. Andrew Bennett, a public servant and Christian academic studying towards a theology degree in Ottawa, is the group's first ambassador.
All religions, all people of faith, and again those who choose not to have faith, need to be protected, their rights need to be respected, and so that's what this office is about. It's promoting that. That's the mandate.
And in its 2012 budget, the Conservative government made changes to the National Energy Board Act, making public hearings on oil and gas exportation licenses optional. These changes matched almost exactly what the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers were lobbying for. We're here with James Munson now, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the changes to the NED. So can you tell us, what's the implication of these changes, and why is it so important to note that the government made these changes based on a lobbying group?
Well, first, I think a bit of context in where these changes fit in. I think most people are familiar with the regulatory reforms the government made last year with its two omnibus budget bills. And it made a number of changes in terms of where the public can have its voice heard when a company applies to make a major energy project, so a pipeline, a refinery, or even mines or large-scale electrical power lines. Mm-hmm. And so some of those changes included sort of focusing the kinds of people that are allowed to participate in hearings. And one of those changes specifically was when a company applies to export oil or gas out of the country, so through a pipeline or through a seaport. Formerly, the National Energy Board, which is the regulator for these things, had to hold a public hearing where things like First Nation consultation and environmental impacts usually get discussed. What CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, asked for in this letter was to take away the mandatory requirement and allow for the National Energy Board to decide on its own discretion when a hearing would be needed. And the argument it made was that in the actual export itself, there's no physical alteration, no physical impact. And what the insight in all this I think is interesting is that the recommendation the letter made is exactly as it appears in the budget changes. So when you look at the budget, it gives the legislation and then has pieces blacked out or pieces added in terms of what the changes will be, and the letter is exactly what shows up in the budget. So it's a little insight into how interests make their mark on the way policy is done.
Right. So now, is there any environmental impact in these changes?
Well, you could kind of see it both ways, because Greenpeace says, as they mentioned, as they're quoted in the story, that to argue that these exports have no physical impact is ridiculous. And because we have an abundance of energy, most of our major energy projects are for export. Mm-hmm. So things like the oil sands or natural gas, we export a lot of that. But you could also make the counter argument that those projects themselves are covered by the environmental impacts are covered by other points in the regulatory process. And so this is specifically for an export license. It's not the license to build an oil sands project or to explore for natural gas or produce natural gas or to build a refinery. So in a way, if you want to root for the government, you could say that they're just focusing the export license on the export itself. And so now, instead of having a public hearing, the National Energy Board is going to focus more on examining oil and gas surplus in Canada when it considers these licenses.
Right. So what other information was inside this ATIP that we received at iPolitics?
It basically outlines the two or three sort of very legalese, boring looking changes. It pointed out that CAP, it shows a bit how CAP viewed these public hearings. They used the example of hearings that were held for liquefied natural gas export facilities that are being planned for Kitimat in British Columbia. And they argued that these were delayed because the National Energy Board decided to hold public hearings, look into the First Nation issues, make sure that everyone was okay with these projects. And CAP argued that this was a delay and sort of unnecessary. It would take a really good, deep examination to see whether everything that was dealt with in these public hearings were indeed covered by other parts of the regulatory hearing.
Right.
Because for every export you do, you have to have some sort of accompanying infrastructure, right? So you need to build a pipeline. And so when those pipelines are done, those usually get, because they're so massive, those usually get public hearings. Or when, let's say if it was an LNG plant, I mean, you have to have some sort of storage facility that also gets assessed by regulators at other points. So, you'd have to go through the previous examples deeply, but in the opinion of CAP, I mean, this really was sort of like double dipping on the regulatory side, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.